Happy Valley is the latest film by Simon Liu, a Brooklyn-based filmmaker who grew up in Hong Kong and Stoke-on-Trent in the UK. Since presenting Harbour City at the 2016 edition of IFFR, Simon has been a regular presence at IFFR with a film at each edition ever since, including E-Ticket, which was presented as part of our Amoto Tiger Short Competition in 2019. Sophie Cavoulacos is assistant curator in the Department of Film at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and oversaw the acquisition of 4 of Simon's films, including Happy Valley, into their collection. She is on the selection committee for New Directors' New Films and Doc Fortnight, and is the lead curator for Modern Mondays, MoMA's avant-garde film series.
Hi, Simon. Good to see you.
Hi, Sophie. Lovely to see you as well.
It's so lovely to be here. I just want to give a quick thanks to everybody at the festival, and Julian Ross especially for inviting me. We're actually a little over a kilometer away from each other in Brooklyn, North Brooklyn. And the fact that we're kind of channeled through this digital connection to audiences in Rotterdam is super exciting.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sophie, for being here, and thank you to Rotterdam again for including my work. It really means a lot to me, and especially this film. I feel as though out of the number of films I've shown at Rotterdam, this is the film that I feel like most personally connected to in a lot of ways. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this work with you today.
Yeah, it's true. I was looking. I mean, they've shown your work for, I think, really seen it through so many different stages. Actually, I think there already are chapters in a Liu filmography, and that's something that we can talk about, we should talk about. But I thought, just as kind of a framing, situating first question, since I think maybe some people will be experiencing the film before, after, in tandem with this conversation, is just if you can tell us, again, there's so many layers, but just situate us of how and where and when, I suppose, you made Happy Valley.
And so the film kind of started out, most of the material was shot in July and August of 2019, when the protest movement, the anti-extradition protests kind of began in June, or May and June. So this film was a lot of it was shot in the first few months of the protest movement. And then I also went back to Hong Kong. I live in New York. And so a lot of my work has to do with kind of going back home and collecting material, and then reworking it back home back where I live in New York. And so I returned to Hong Kong in November, which was the way that the protest movement looked, the way that the city was kind of working within that context. It looked incredibly different than when I had been there previously. Yeah, I was very interested. It's kind of follows up a kind of train of thought from my previous film, Signal 8, in that film I was very interested in kind of taking common spectacle, urban structures that might kind of denote some kind of threat, or might kind of seem as though there is some kind of underlying tension within that kind of urban framework. And so this film kind of continues on that trajectory, and I really think about this work a lot as being spaces seeing changes happen over time, objects seeing spaces and things change over time. Then that was something that was really interesting to me, because the protest movement that took place began largely in May 2019 and kind of dissipated in June 2020, when new legislation was put into place that kind of criminalized broad acts of protest, as well as other kind of subversive acts. So at the time when I was made, so this work has really evolved and changed since I finished it almost a year ago, in that at the time, this was kind of a repository or place to kind of put all of these different, all these a multitude of things that were kind of unfolding to do with the protest movement. And so I keep thinking about this idea of how are we going to retain the information from this certain time period? How is there going to be this kind of a legacy of what happened now that we can no longer really openly talk about it in so many ways? So that was kind of a hypothetical idea of making the project, and kind of the reality of the thing now, to be honest with you. So
yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think. I mean, I think you do too, of Signal 8 and Happy Valley as kind of a duet in a certain way, and individually and also as a pair, they really ask questions about kind of defining a before and an after of an event perhaps when change and evolution or devolution is a condition, is an ongoing condition and not a discrete moment. And also is one that I think you make space for to be experienced on a lot of different levels, on a personal level, on a family level, on a collective level. And I'd love to hear you talk about the kind of perspective of like non-human agents or actors or all those things around us that are absorbing change and witnessing it in different ways. And I guess the other thing, those who follow your work, I think I've already thought about this with you over the years, but just to say, for the conversation, that these aren't protest images. If you were to think about what that means and look it up in the dictionary, it's also a new lexicon, I think, of what it means to capture moments of resistance or moments of endurance, or I don't know. I wonder what you make of that.
Totally, yeah. I mean, to go back to this idea of like the charge of spaces, the charge of objects, a lot of the places in the film, there's like, there's a statue of Sir Thomas Jackson, who founded the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation, otherwise known as HSBC. There's a lot of it's an international bank where you forget that this was like a bank that was founded in order to kind of allow the trafficking of money. Not quite trafficking, but you know what I mean, the exchange of money between the British colonial empire and their Oriental counterparts. And so, yeah, I was very interested in this idea of like this historical perspective, but also a personal perspective. I keep thinking, actually, Julian Ross, who you mentioned earlier on, he was in Hong Kong in January 2019. And that was the last time I went there the last time I was there before the protest movement began in June. And I keep thinking back, I think it was January 8th, 2019. And I keep thinking about, like, that was the last time I would walk around the city that I grew up in, which is like so intrinsically connected to my identity, without like a second thought. Without like really like, without like it was the last day I would spend just like not thinking about all these other things, and so now like my experiences, and I haven't been there in over a year now. I normally go back twice a year. Obviously the pandemic has kind of prevented that from being possible, but I keep thinking about this idea that like every street, every corner, there's been some kind of like reference to the protests. It was like, it's known as being like the most documented and live streamed protest in history. As it was happening, you would like, it was throughout the city, and you would see these moments of turmoil in all these places that I had these personal attachments to. And so I keep thinking about this idea of like a personal longing and a personal nostalgia and a sense of personal identity that's now forever like overlaid and overlapped with all of these images and all of these things that have forever changed the city. And so I was thinking that like, as people, we're so conditioned to have these emotional responses to things. We're so conditioned to have a very like subjective experience of these places. And I keep connecting that back to like, how do the objects and the spaces themselves kind of speak back to us? How does a railing that has now been mangled because of some kind of form of unrest, what does that mean to see that? And like, what is that saying to you? So I was very interested in this idea of like personifying objects in that sense as well.
Yeah, and then you even think of, I mean, as you alluded to with kind of the both physical and very immaterial notion of something like HSBC, it's like, what does a railing do to organize bodies in space and a body politic in space? I mean, I think that's something through the association and the editing, how you string images together. And I mean, you alluded to this, but I am interested in how you combine things that might have an outward and already significance or meaning or kind of a legible symbolism, and then the idea that you're creating symbols or mementos or traces among those, and like what like it's not, there's some ambiguity, but you leave room for ambiguity, I think, in a really interesting way, and then also in a way that has to do with actually like an emotive territory. You
Yeah.
know, like the idea that you can have all these overlapping emotions of forward-looking and nostalgic, and being on the brink of something, and maybe something that is already passed. So yeah, I think actually I have to say, as someone who's ever been in Hong Kong, I feel like I've discovered the city through your films in such a powerful way, and I think that just speaks to the thought that you put into what the images do to your city, you know, in its right way.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because like I'll go back to something that you mentioned towards the beginning of your question, that this idea of like these spaces and the way that things function. You know, I really wanted to highlight this idea of like a hidden skeleton, or something that was kind of these, like, I mean, I think the suspension bridge at the end of the film, that's the idea of like these structures that hold things into place, these mechanisms that like make the city work, that make things happen. But as the protest movement was happening, you know, like literally the city was ground to a halt. If you kind of tear apart the mechanisms that make things work and then loosely put things back together, what does that mean for the future of a place? You know what I mean? It's like if a doctor were to like kind of like reformat the way that like a certain set of circuits might function, or electricians should we say, the way like a certain number of circuits will function, you know, you might like, it might continue to work, but it'll forever be altered in a way. And so I was very interested in kind of capturing this idea of like how things have been altered over time. And yeah, you were kind of alluding to this idea of like a new lexicon of images, or a new way of kind of depicting protest, a new way of depicting unrest. And so I think about this film in a lot of ways, and kind of like this kind of idea of like what's like the difference between like poetry and documentary and cinema, you know. And often like poetic cinema, there is this kind of connection to these documentary aspects. And I feel as though like watching the film, I have these very like personal associations to almost every cut, almost every image, but they're almost like a secret in a way. I'm very interested in this idea of like if I sat with you and like was like, oh, to me this shot alludes to this exact reference, or this shot alludes to this other reference, and maybe another Hong Konger might like notice that connection. But I think it's this idea of like, it's the charge between these images and the charge of those associations and those secrets within the image that I want to kind of embellish, and I want to kind of highlight in a way.
Yeah, and that really makes me think of something that you started off with, which is really, I would say, the difference between these two films, so Signal and Happy Valley, and some of your previous films like E-Ticket or multiple projection works, which is, and this is almost ironic, you know, that there's a step progression for anybody in their practice, but I think for you, it was a next step for you to be still, be still in a single channel in one screen. And I do, I mean, you know, experiencing all those works collectively, I think, you know, kind of shows the strength and the power of each of those strategies. But this strategy seems to be about what you've just talked about, which is to force the linger. And what does that do for you? I'm really interested in hearing you talk about that. The idea that it's somehow a quieter work, more meditative work. But certainly for me, an extremely powerful work. Like, what do you make of that?
Well, I relate this back to like a Q&A. Jerome Hyler is a San Francisco like experimental filmmaker. I saw a Q&A with him, I think at the New York Film Festival in 2015. He had shown In the Stonehouse, which he made.
I was there.
Oh, you were there? Oh, amazing! Yeah. Well, so that film is, you know, is incredibly, it's gorgeous, but it's incredibly layered and incredibly abstract and very, you know, impressionistic. And in the Q&A, he was like, you know, this was a very specific time in my life. And looking at this film and looking at the material from that project, you know, there was so many layers, there was so much going on. And he said that he wished he had just filmed things as they were more. He said he wished that, like, instead of covering up all of these moments with all these layers, he wished he just had more material from that specific specific moment. So we had that memento for that time. He had that moment, that image to hold on to bring himself back to that moment. And so as I was making the like High View and a lot of these other abstract works, that kind of thought really stuck in my mind in so many ways. And I knew that it was like, in order for myself to kind of, when I was making these abstract films in so many ways, like this idea of Hong Kong changing forever in terms of like the city and the culture, as we've known it to be, going through a process of disappearance, it was kind of a hypothetical idea. There was this idea that in 2047, Hong Kong would fully be integrated back into mainland China, that's when that Hong Kong would have a certain level of autonomy until then. But then there was always this kind of sense of like, is that totally going to be the case? Are they going to hold true to that idea? And so those abstract works were made more with that in mind, with this idea of like a hypothetical disappearance. But now that like, the sense of Hong Kong changing is so concrete and has really actually just fully happened at this point, as sad as it is to say, it feels really important to me that I have done this, that these time periods where I was out filming these really important moments in Hong Kong's history that within Hong Kong, soon enough, we won't be able to speak about openly, that they were captured in this way. And that there was a sense of linger, that I allowed for the sense of momentum and to build on each image. And so to work with that, I feel as though these are the first projects where I kind of worked on the sound design myself, and where there was like synchronized sound. And to go back to what you were saying, there was the idea of like a match cut. When I was working these films and there was like match cuts and graphic matches, I was like, whoa, this is the language of cinema. You know what I mean? I'd gone so far in the other direction that like to go back to like editing and filmmaking in its most basic formats was like felt like really really different to me and really exciting to work in that vein. And so in the soundtrack also there's a lot of like references to like very classic Hong Kong Cantonese culture, and like the canto pop music, and the TVB soap operas from the 80s that are very like synonymous with the city and with the culture. And so I took a lot of that kind of material and kind of mangled them together to kind of create like a melted format, like a kind of like a condensed form of like a kind of audio history and audio identity of this space, with this sense that like, what do those things mean in that context moving forward? What do these signifiers of a culture at a specific time period mean when everything else has changed? Like, will there still be, and those things will always be the case, but I think it's interesting and kind of heartbreaking to see forms of expression and think about how those things might mutate further in the future. And so I think that also has a lot to do with this idea of lingering and this idea of pausing on certain things too.
Yeah, it's perfect, because I wanted to talk about that next, with the score, the soundtrack, I don't know how you just describe it, is so special, and also I think guides you through the images in a different kind of way, and also is again a new or a renewed kind of approach for you. And I love the way you say that. It's like in some ways you have to go astray from something that's actually like a pretty basic filmmaking tenet. And by the way, I relate to that on the curatorial side.
Totally, yeah.
I really, we've talked about this. I really relate to that. But then to be able to come back and to find new possibilities in like a very basic accoutrement or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, I guess you just try a little bit, but if you could talk more about when you were recording sound, if you're at the same time as you were shooting, or if you were also kind of taking field recordings, like in some ways, like the soundtrack comes across as like a collective field recording or like a cultural field recording. And it also contributes, I think, again, to the kind of emotional texture of the work. So you kind of already touched on that, but maybe just give us a little bit more of maybe kind of the technical or the assembly work that went into the sound.
Yeah, I mean, well, on a very to ground it down to something very specific, actually. So I was saying that some of the filming took place in November of 2019, and so that was actually during the siege of Hong Kong Polytechnic University, which was really like the climax of the entire protest movement. And I was in Hong Kong. I got to Hong Kong literally at the start of this 13-day long siege of the of Hong Kong Polytechnic. And my dad's apartment where he lives is, 200 meters away from Hong Kong Polytechnic. So I was literally like in my house, in my dad's apartment, just like watching some like horrific events unfold, and it was like, and like I would see like the blue water cannons firing, the tear gas rising, but it was like a lot of the frontline conflict was like literally just outside of my view. But the strangest thing was that those images were actually being filled in by the live stream on the TV, literally just to my right. So that was, I mean, it's really heartbreaking thinking back about it, but and I hate to use a real cliche here, but that was really like the day the music died. That was the day where it felt like we'd reached the point of no return. There was no going back there. Yeah, I mean, I was like that experience of that 2 weeks while I was there, when it felt like, there was no way I could look at the city the same way after those 14 days. And so a lot of the sound was actually made while that was happening. And there was something, I hate to use the word cathartic, there was something cathartic about kind of like going, like scrolling through all these signifiers of Hong Kong's audio history, cultural history through the sound as this was happening outside, as I had kind of seen these events unfold. And so yeah, as I was kind of saying as well, in the technical sense, I was kind of taking like little shards, little notes, little phrases from songs and kind of extending them to kind of like not quite hear the song, but to hear like an essence of a song. Or like, how there was like, how like a certain...
It's like a memory of a song. Like if you had a song stuck in your head, or a song that you used to hear like in your dad's car or something.
Yeah.
Like, again, I feel like you create this openness where I can't understand the content of being a Hong Konger, but I can understand perhaps that feeling of distance or dislocation. In some ways, like distance has always been part of, conceptually and technically, of your filmmaking practice, totally. Right? Yeah. Shooting in Hong Kong, editing in New York. And I feel like this film was found a new, I mean, existentially, like found a new expression of that. Yeah. Like, what does it mean to be dislocated from the place that you physically are?
Yeah.
And again, and I think you're allowed to use the word cathartic. Like,
yeah, but I feel bad about using the word cathartic, as it's like, I mean, this is what so much of the film is about as well. This idea of like, what does it mean to have these like, and I think as the pandemic has unfolded over the past year, we've also felt, I think many of us have also felt the same thing. What does it mean to have these like personal memories, these personal associations, to be involved in your own personal feelings as it feels like the world is falling apart, And like, so like, I it's okay for me to feel catharsis in that sense. But is this something, I don't know, it's like a kind of like a sense of, like, it's like what is it? What do the little things mean when like there's the little things seem not important anymore, They are so important. That's what I kind of want to bring myself back to remember. But something that you also mentioned about this idea of like, of hearing songs that your parents played in the car or something. It's not like you remember the whole song. You remember like a little part of it. You remember like a certain line. You remember the way that it felt or sounded. And so like, yeah, extrapolating that like tiny moment into something that's elongated, and layering that, I think is something I'm also like really interested in.
Yeah, and finding not only value, but also maybe we can even say like comfort or respite in the fragmentary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, if you've allowed us, as viewers, all of us, to think about the little things while not losing sight of the big things, that just, again, helps you understand how to be in your body and in this time. And in some way, the if we can talk about a micro experience and a micro scale and a macro scale, I think like you're always showing us new ways that those can intersect and interact, but not in a definitive way, right? I wasn't kind of an open-ended way. Yeah.
It's also really interesting to think about like this idea of like Hong Kong has been synonymous in like so much of visual culture, you know, like cyberpunk, science fiction, it's all Blade Runner, it's all tied up into Hong Kong's culture. Every Chinatown around the world is like a facsimile of Hong Kong. And so to go from like that kind of visual identity and those being the images that you associate with Hong Kong and media to the way that like, oh, now it's seen around the world in a much different context during the protests. And so I think what was important to me in making this work as well, going back to this idea of like poetic cinema and documentary cinema, is that like this is kind of an alternative to this idea of like of documenting a protest. This is an alternative of documenting world-changing events on a very personal scale. And you know, like I think the macro and the micro, they're they're intricately connected. You know, and like Hong Kong isn't dominating the news anymore. You're not seeing these sensationalized events on a day-to-day basis. You know, the media has moved on because there's no more images to be shown that are newsworthy. But the unrest is still there. The turmoil is still there. The sense of loss is still there. And so I think it's crucial that like, we're not only documenting the moments that protest happens. We're not only documenting these like, we're not only documenting the sensational, we're not only documenting these things, these explosive moments. We're like staying true to people's feelings in the aftermath. We're staying true to the day-to-day, because that is actually where the work is. The work isn't in like these massive things. The work actually really starts on a personal level. And so that's something that I'm like glad to be like reminded of, and to try and make work in this context. You know, I'm very cautious of this approach of going somewhere and capturing these images without having a personal attachment to this place.
Yeah, I mean, it has a name, isn't it called like protest tourism or something like this? And yes, I mean, again, if we're thinking about the being on the brink and the aftermath as being two overlapping conditions that maybe never have that kind of make you question the idea of a decisive moment or a decisive image. You know, your film also, I think, asks questions about like an attention economy or a circulation of images. Mm-hmm. And that's where, yeah, I mean, to find what to make a stake for a quieter and more personal way of image making in that context, I think again is really powerful. And the other thing to mention, I mean, you talked about Hong Kong in the news, but also Hong Kong as a city of cinema. Like I mean, again, it's not somewhere I've been, and I hope one day I will. But the idea that, you know, the escalators or the neon lights, like the things that you do with that, you both include them and present them, and also somehow have some kind of distance from those.
I think the film kind of sits in the sense of, you know, it's changed a lot, as I said before. You know, there was like this image, there's that image of the face mask in the film, and as I was editing the film together, actually, it was actually an allusion to the government actually banned face masks because they were being used to conceal people's identities, and that was on October 1st of 2019. But within 3 months, like face masks were completely mandatory. So I think there's this idea of like images changing over time, the meaning of images changing over time, the context of images shifting over time, and I think that what I was kind of really wanted to explore in this film was to kind of take things and moments that have a really concrete identity and to kind of capture them into this very sensory format in order for it to kind of be a time capsule, or to kind of add to some kind of legacy of work that's emerging through what's been like, you know, super heartbreaking 2 years. And as I kind of sit here in New York, you know, I haven't been back home in a year. I don't know when the next time I'll be back, but I just want to say that I feel almost at a loss for words and what to say about what might happen, but I want to believe in a future for the city. I want to believe that even though we've lost so much, even though there's no way that things will be the same again, I want to kind of make this work in the face of all of that, to say that, you know, I want to believe that there's going to be a future, and I want to believe that what I've known and loved will continue to be. So that's kind of
no, that's a beautiful beautiful closing thought, and just to remind ourselves also that you place that in the title, you know, in a certain way, like whether it's a question or a proposition or a hope, or I know it also has, you know, an origin, more specific origin, but I always like the way you title your films, and they, they have like different layers in them as well. So Happy Valley, I think, is a good pair of words to keep in our brains for 2021.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. This is so nice. It was so nice to talk to you.
It was a real treat, and hopefully next year we'll be together in the theater in Rotterdam.
Yes, please. I would dream of it. That'd be amazing.